Hello and welcome to Adventures in AI, where the Insight Flow team members share things that have caught our attention over the past week and talk about our own experiences in the world of AI. I'm Giles.
I'm Rich.
And I'm Graham. And I think one of the key things that caught our eye over the last week and caught most of the world's eye, most of the world who's interested in AI's eye, is the battles at OpenAI, which for an outsider have been fairly perplexing. I mean, there's some interesting pieces there. So for those who don't know, OpenAI is one of the, if not the biggest AI business in the world. It's likely to be one of the new tech giants. And if we believe the future of AI, OpenAI is likely to lead us into a completely new world. It's quite out of the blue. Was it 10 days or so ago now? They fired Sam Altman, who is the CEO and the guy who founded OpenAI. And over a fairly extraordinary 48 hours, this got reversed. Now, there's an interesting bit there because the OpenAI board is very explicitly there to protect humanity from the adverse effects of AI. And we don't know why Sam Altman got fired. We do know, I think, why he got rehired, because most of the company threatened to walk out, and Microsoft, the biggest shareholder, very much stood behind Sam Altman. But we don't know the details. We have hints. We've heard hints that one of the problems was a conflict between an ethical, protective approach and one that looked more towards commercialization and monetization. But we don't know what the trigger is. And there's been a couple of suggestions, and there's fun suggestions. And the first one is possibly worth looking at is the idea that OpenAI's dev teams have created a new product which profoundly impacts humanity. It profoundly affects that protect humanity brief for the board, and they got a bit twitchy about it. So QStar, the product that people are suggesting it might be, and this is largely guesswork, but QStar, as people are suggesting it, it becomes quite an interesting beast in and of itself. So I thought it's worth, before we carry on and look at the sort of deeper implications of what's happening at OpenAI and what it means for us and business, it's probably worth having a quick look at QStar. So nobody knows exactly what it is, but there is something called QStar that is going to come out of OpenAI at some point soon. We don't know when, we don't know what it is exactly. But the two suggestions that I've seen, and there are probably other ones, about what QStar might be, is the first one is that QStar now is the bit that allows AI to count. Now, I find it hilarious that AI, or Gen AI in particular, is really, really bad at maths. And I know it's something that's had people scratching their head. They keep on showing it how to do maths, and it keeps on not doing maths. And it's certainly something that's quite fun. If you ask it to do maths, it is spectacularly wrong. So the first one, AI can count, or if QStar is this thing, it means that AI can count, can start to do mathematical functions, and can start to process numerical data, which I think has some fairly interesting impacts.
Yeah, and actually, so this is all based on rumors as well, but I heard about QStar that actually the part of it that they were worried about, it wasn't the level of the maths it can do at the moment, because I heard it was potentially that just kind of like a high school student. So it's not going to solve the answer to the universe right away, which, as we know, the answer's 42 anyway. But rather it was the fact that how it was reasoning with its own answers and learning up by itself. And if you think about how large language models work, it does a lot. There's a lot of machine learning that's done in kind of stages where the developers say, okay, here's your information, learn about this, and then we get the next update of ChatGPT, and it's static. But it seemed like the worry with QStar was that actually we're handing more of that reasoning and learning over to the AI, to the point where it can do it quite effectively itself.
Yeah. So does that mean then that the potential for this is to actually start creating other AIs? Because the part of this I don't really understand, and maybe you guys can enlighten me a little bit, is for a large language model to be able to do maths, to my mind, it's not particularly helpful. Now, to develop a model that is a mathematician and can be better as a mathematician than any human, I completely understand the value of that. But having a large language model do maths doesn't make any sense to me, because it can just call an API and computers can do maths really well anyway. So it doesn't actually need to be able to do that. So I'm potentially just missing what all the fuss is about.
For me, it's the saying, it's the asking it. Well, it's the asking it what is the problem that I have, and at the moment you'd have to help it as to how to solve that problem. And if it's a really hard problem, you might not be able to really help it very well. But it's this point about where, okay, you can say, this is what I need to find out, and almost like just go. You figure out how to how to do it.
So it's that level of autonomy that the model can then have in terms of how it works stuff out.
Yeah.
And is that different to what they've been trying to do with agents, where the model articulates its own kind of tasks that it needs to do in order to solve whatever problem you've given it?
Yeah, so the issue with agents at the moment, in particular solving maths problems, is it's still all based on language and heavily based on large language models. And Q star, it's that, we don't know a huge amount about it, but it's that step away from it being a language model to, I guess, a more specific maths model that can speak to you in a human language as well.
And so is this where I get to talk about multimodal models again and say, actually, we have a maths version and a picture version, and and a language version, essentially?
Yeah, exactly. And so the maths bit was the bit that was always lagging behind with large language models, and I think we've potentially talked about it before, where we said actually we think it might always lag due to this reason, as doing a maths problem is very different to how language is structured, and it seems that this Q star, it's a completely different model based around maths. So it'll be really interesting to see actually if these two models are going in tandem. Can Q star quite rapidly increase in how good it is, the same way that we've seen GPTs improve over even just the last 18 months. It's come on a huge amount.
Sorry, the other thing that you brought out there, Rich, was it's learning in a different way, and that's the other description of Q star I've seen, that it's not so much about the maths bit, but the bit that was different in Q star is that the AIs are learning in a much less arbitrary way. The idea of what is good and what is right and what is correct is much more baked into the learning process, with the implication that it learns a huge amount faster, but also with the implication that it's making some kind of choices as it goes through. That's not the classical reward process of traditional large language model learning. And that one, yeah, if that's true, you can kind of see why it might have been scary to the OpenAI board.
Yeah, and thinking abstractly actually could work really well in maths. So, for example, imaginary numbers, and if anyone doesn't know that, it's the I is an imaginary number that's the square root of -1, which is, if you think about it in classical terms, is impossible. But somebody had worked all this out, and then engineers came along and thought, oh, actually, we can use that. So they've managed to relate a very abstract thinking and theory in maths to the real world.
So is it therefore applying creativity to maths in a way that still allows you to get the maths correct? That's the thing that they've done.
Potentially, yeah. I think think we don't know enough yet, but yeah, that's what it sounds like, certainly.
I mean, the other theory is that Sam Altman just said something nasty to one of the board and they took against it, but I think that's unlikely.
And dear listener, it should be noted that amongst the three of us, the maths and theoretical physics graduate is probably fairly obvious by now. And the closest I've ever got to imaginary numbers is imaginary friends, but that's a sad story of a fairly different podcast. But I mean, fascinating stuff, and we don't know what Q star is. This is all guessing. But if it is going to go down this path, this idea, the concern appears to be very much about the ethics and the sort of deeper philosophy of what AI is and what it means to humans. And I think it's true. We hear a lot about ethical problems in AI, but they feel fairly vague. And it's probably worth talking through a few of what those ethical problems might be, and which, for you guys, which do you think are true and important ethical problems that are talked about around AI?
Yeah, so there's obviously a number of different areas that they talk about in terms of ethics around AI. So this covers everything from the environmental impact of AI, given that we've talked on previous podcasts about the fact that AI uses something like 10 times more energy, and in some cases 100 times more energy than traditional methods of computing. And hence my slight cynicism about why should we actually train an AI to do maths when computers are pretty good at it already? But obviously, different thing. I guess the one that for me gets mentioned most is bias and fairness, and particularly in the context of things like banking, where if we've got an AI that's making decisions about credit scores and things like that, or about my credit and whether I should get credit, and it says no, and I don't understand, and there's no kind of explanation for why it said no, just computer says no, then that becomes a real problem in society generally, because you could end up with a sort of haves and have-nots based on a decision made by an AI that humans haven't really understood how it's been programmed. And so that part I understand. My understanding is the research that OpenAI has been doing, and this may just be my lack of knowledge, is primarily in the kind of transformer space around language. So if they're and language models in essence can have implicit bias. I know they've done a lot of work to try and reduce that or get rid of it as far as possible. But the simple fact is they've trained it on the output of humans, so the internet, and the internet has got some pretty dark biases itself. So it's they actually have to work quite hard to fine tune the models after they've been trained to remove racist bias and remove sexist bias and all this kind of thing. But I think for me those are probably the two key places, and then sort of falling out of those things like who do I complain to when the model is biased, and how do I get evidence that it is biased. So I think the other point I'd make about this is we're already seeing the effects of AI biases in social media, because social media effectively isn't, the algorithms are an AI of sorts, and the fact that the AI in that case is designed to prioritize attention over accuracy, or attention over sanity, maybe another way of describing it. But it means then that we can see the impact on society. So I think it's Molly Russell it was going to be 21 years old this week, and she committed suicide because of posts that she was seeing which were all about driving her attention rather than about protecting her. And so I think that's why the ethics debate is a live one. How that applies to OpenAI and their board decision, I'm not sure. And I also really don't have any insight into that particularly, but you can kind of see how some of those things might lead into people getting worried.
Actually, Giles, your point there about decision making, or handing decisions over to the AI, it reminded me of, if you remember when kind of the potential of self-driving cars was first coming out, there was a lot of talk around what's the decision that the car would make to swerve to save your life and potentially kill somebody else, or severely image them, or take the course that would injure the least amount of people. And if that means that you're the person that drives into the wall, then tough.
Yeah, and that's a favourite of ethicists. It's a kind of rehash of an old ethics one, which off the top of my head I can't remember, but it's either the one about the train cart or there's a bus one that they use regularly. I mean, the hard part, and that one really does bring into sharp relief the difference between commercial interests and societal interests, because who would buy a car that would kill them rather than killing the people outside? So commercially, it would be very hard to sell a vehicle that would drive you into something dangerous in order to protect a bus full of people.
And so having teased Richard slightly about his degree, I'm going to confess at this point that I'm the philosophy graduate here. And what's really interesting about the study of ethics is that whilst from the outside they may feel fairly definitive and fairly black and white, they're no such thing. And in fact, one of the things that you have to acknowledge in studying ethics themselves is that you come at them from a point of bias, you come at them from a cultural standpoint and cultural viewpoint, and things that feel completely sensible and sane in one cultural context do not in another. And I think that, if we're talking about AI ethics, some of the stuff you get to is actually a little bit around that area. Bias as a thing is absolutely black and white. It exists. But what that bias is and how you find bias and how do you categorize something as being biased or not becomes much, much more difficult to do. And I'm not sure that, in the context of, that we're often talking about AI, what does it mean for business? I'm not sure that I've yet heard anything particularly useful around the ethical warning about AI, apart from, and it's one we keep on coming back to, apart from the fact that it clearly allows bad actors to do more bad stuff, which I think is generally accepted as being not an ethically desirable outcome. But the bad actor bit aside, but the intrinsic ethics of AI are very hard to describe in and of themselves, but even harder, I think, to describe in terms of what it actually means for business. Now, Giles, you mentioned banks earlier, and that's probably a fairly clear one. But if you're a business person thinking about ethics in AI, I'm not sure that there's a huge amount of helpful information there and what it actually means to them. And moving it on a little bit, what should they do to avoid ethical issues in using AIs?
So I think, to answer the first part of that, I think actually part of the problem is in the whole discussion, which I think makes a sort of implicit assumption that it's kind of one AI rather than many. And if you think about businesses, every business has its own bias, and deliberately, because a brand is a set of biases encapsulated in something that people can kind of look at and go, oh yeah, that's Nike or that's Apple or whatever. And we like a brand because it aligns with our own biases. And so, the ideal scenario for a business is that they have their own AI. And, for a bank, in the case of credit kind of AI, that has the biases of that organization and the kind of jurisdiction within which it operates baked into it. So actually, I almost think, the science fiction is all about this single AI that takes over the world and does all of this stuff. But I think the reality actually could be completely the opposite, that all of us, and to a certain extent, what we're trying to build in Insight Flow is this. We want to be able to build personal AIs that become an extension and a superpower for us as individuals, and will therefore allow our kind of strengths and weaknesses to be enhanced, or strengths particularly, to be enhanced. Sorry, weaknesses even. Get it the right way around. The things I'm bad at, I want the AI to be really good at. And if we can get to a point where they're able to tune AIs quickly, so I think the learning stuff becomes really interesting. If a model can learn really quickly and can learn particularly my interests really quickly, and I can kind of effectively have personal AI, so it's running on my laptop or my phone or whatever, or maybe a number of personal AIs for different aspects of my life, that to me actually becomes way, way more powerful, and also dramatically reduces the ethical risk of AI, other than, for certain people in society who, the more powerful it makes them, the more dangerous they are. But, as long as all of us have got the same superpowers, then we're competing on an equal footing.
I think the other big ethical issue with businesses, and it's something that we've talked about a lot, it's what's AI doing with your data, or what are you doing with your clients or customers' data that's going through AI? And I think we can see the benefits of actually there being quite strong data protection regulations that have been in existence for a while, because it's kind of almost given AI a head start in that regard, in terms of getting businesses on board with what they're doing with your data, and showing that that's being held securely and not being processed in ways that you wouldn't want it processed.
So I think what's interesting about that side of things in terms of data protection is it's more, I think, immediately in terms of OpenAI specifically, more about where do they get the data to train the models from, who owns that, what does it mean in terms of IP and IP protection, and in a competitive environment, if I can train an AI to go and scrape everything that my competitors have and find out everything about them in a way that is easy for me to consume, then things like corporate espionage become much easier, as it does at a state level as well. But then, what does that mean in terms of the internal ethics of a company, as opposed to, if you like, the external brand ethics of that same company?
I think you raise an interesting point, which is, again, I don't think it's a particularly heavily, well, I know it's a very frequently talked about part of AI, in the ethical problem is how ethical is it to train an AI on somebody else's IP? And I know that Rory Cellan-Jones, the BBC technology correspondent, was slightly wincing that he produced his autobiography and talked about technology and what have you, and was somewhat shocked to discover that competing with him in Amazon was a book about Rory Cellan-Jones that had quite clearly been written by AI, but it was competing with him for sales of his own book. And yeah, even though he's a real technology pundit and supporter and what have you, he did feel that there was at a point there that ethical boundaries were being crossed. So I recognise that this is a sort of combination of bad actor and intrinsic ethical issues within AI. But I do think it's a really interesting one around copyright and around protecting data and protecting knowledge in ways that possibly we're not terribly good at articulating just yet.
I mean, again, there is potentially another completely different way of thinking about it, which is, you could argue, the Chinese way of thinking about intellectual property, and that it's a free for all, and and I think, you know, in a world where information is cheap, then protecting knowledge and information actually arguably should become less relevant. What is relevant is protecting insight or knowledge or whatever you want to call it. But even then, you know, we almost have to have a rethink about intellectual property and what constitutes it, or you know, there's an argument to say we should have a rethink about what constitutes intellectual property, because if everyone can produce loads of content using AI all the time, then other than trying to put the genie back in the bottle and saying, no, this was, you know, we should shut down ChatGPT right away because it was trained on a whole load of content that was copyright from a whole load of people, right? Which may or may not be true. OpenAI are trying to, you know, create a sort of assurance environment where they're saying that we'll provide legal protection or kind of insurance for anyone that gets taken to court for copyright. But actually, you know, I do think it's worth asking the question, is copyright the right set of laws? If, you know, assuming we want a society, or we're moving towards a society where AI is going to really transform productivity, going to transform what we can achieve as human beings in the world, and all of these other things, then actually we do need to think quite carefully about where the value that we want to protect as a society is, and therefore, you know, what does that mean in terms of the laws and stuff that we have to protect it.
You've just reminded me there of actually copyright in terms of music. It's when you're using samples and maybe you've mangled it so that it sounds reasonably different, and it's actually really hard to define that point at which actually where were you copying something, or where were you creating a new sound or element of your music that's inspired by the original. And with AI, because we know how it's putting together words based on what it's been trained, and that can be copyrighted work, at which point is that putting it together of the content copying versus original, well, quote unquote AI original content?
Well, and I think the funny thing in this whole discussion, if you think about what we do as humans in conversation all the time, is we quote or we use turns of phrase that have been created by somebody at some point, usually Shakespeare, and so part of our algorithm is basically spouting stuff that someone else came up with, and all of language is something that someone else came up with, apart from the word that I'm just about to invent called Kiknib. But apart from that, everything else has been invented by someone else.
Yeah, you have to invent the meaning of it before you invent the word. It's a service design approach that says understand the need and then create the solution.
It's that feeling you get when you join a conference call and your headphones and things aren't connected correctly.
Which is a very useful concept. So what's the word again, Giles?
Knickford.
Very good.
It's Swedish.
But one of the things that comes out of that conversation is actually reflecting back on something that you said earlier, Rich, the idea that says that, you know, if you're an organization and you are concerned about copyright and what have you, then you kind of have to be starting to think about building your own agents and looking at your own data and making sure that it's a two-way protective system, that your organization is not overly using other people's copyright, which of course is clearly a commercial concern at least, but that your own IP is not being released out into the wild. And it may well be that as we go forward, that becomes one of the significant things that people implementing AI have to be thinking about. And I think it's a useful point to consider when you're doing that.
Yeah, exactly. And so if you own your implementation of AI, and there are different levels of ownership, absolutely you can make sure that you can retain more control over its output. But what that also kind of makes me think about is what we know throughout history, companies actually choose to act unethically. So if you're retaining more control over how you use AI, potentially that can swing the other way too. So you can deliberately design it to act in a way that maybe someone like OpenAI wouldn't let you behave.
I mean, I think something else that's potentially missed in all of these discussions is, so there is definitely a difference in cost, significant difference in cost between the current cost of training AI versus the cost of running AI. And so, OpenAI have spent an absolute fortune training their models, but Moore's law, or whatever the AI equivalent of that is, suggests that will be 10 times cheaper in a few years' time, probably 100 times cheaper, actually, because I think the costs are dropping really quickly. And, AI chips have got, I think, roughly 10 times faster in the last couple of years. So if that rate continues, then actually compounded, then in 3-5 years' time, they'll be quite accessible for me to do on a laptop. And I can already train simple models on a laptop or on server or whatever. So actually, if you think of AI as the tool that you use to gain competitive advantage, then yes, you need the skills, but actually increasingly the skills are likely to be baked into the AI anyway. So you can kind of get the AI to help you with the process of training the AI. And maybe this is where we do hit the singularity. But it means then that everyone has their power. It becomes very democratizing, because no one can control the power of AI in one place. And again, this comes back to all of the sci-fi kind of narrative is about one organization or one person or one country controlling the AI. And actually, the reality is, unless someone can control all of the compute, then that's very unlikely to happen. And so so the good guys will have AIs that they can use to counteract the bad guys.
I think your point about kind of it's almost impossible to have one person controlling all of AI. What actually really starkly brings this home is the fact that at OpenAI, within days, literally the majority of the department have got job offers from Microsoft. So it's this point. If you're holding back, say because you're worried about ethics, somebody else is going to move it forwards. Then actually that makes it a really hard balance of making sure that you stay in control versus the kind of control that you want to apply to the AI.
Yeah, and I think that also an understanding of where do we actually need control. Because if I think about, if we're calling ChatGPT via API and then adding our own sort of secret source on top of it, which is essentially what we're doing, that might be enough to give us a different and differentiated superpower compared to someone else. And actually, at that point, it's kind of doesn't matter that it's OpenAI or Anthropic or any of the other kind of hosting firms, provided that the secret source that we add on top of it makes it unique. And I think there's a piece there that says, again, yes, you might need some fundamental level of control over, to ensure you don't end up in a monopoly situation with only one provider of models. But again, my argument is, well, actually, in 5 years' time, anyone with a laptop will be able to train even quite complex large language models on their laptop, and therefore that's unlikely to really prevent, or to create a real monopoly, I think.
So to start to sort of wrap this up, just a quick question to both of you, and to bring it back to where we started. Do you think that what happened at OpenAI over the last couple of weeks means that you trust them more or less to be ethical managers of the global AI network?
I don't care.
I I don't think I trust them any less than any of the other AI companies.
Yeah, so I'm going to qualify what I just said. Actually, what at this stage for me, what matters is what their platform is able to do, and it is definitely good to know that they have some kind of ethical oversight. Does it make me more or less likely to use that versus something else? No. Again, we've always had a view that we would be model agnostic, and I think that remains. But would we switch away from OpenAI if their models are easier to use and and we know have a reasonable level of protection built into them? Absolutely not. What for me would make the difference is if we suddenly saw the model becoming racist, or they were doing things that were against our commercial interests, then that would make a big difference as to whether we continued. So maybe it gives us a couple of warning flags, but I don't think for me it's certainly not a deal breaker. Honestly, I think the whole thing was bad communication at board level. So they didn't, the board didn't in any way signal what was going on. They didn't preface it. They didn't, the way it was communicated was terrible. It's just it's a failure of corporate governance rather than anything bigger, I think.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And actually thinking about it, I'm in the same boat as you. As actually, I'd rather go with the smarter model, or maybe a kind of at the point where kind of smart plus cost meet each other, optimize. That would still be the biggest driving factor towards which AI model to use, rather except for the obvious kind of potential red flags that you've mentioned.
Yeah, and we would always test to make sure those kind of things aren't going to be an issue. So I think where you end up is the proof's in the pudding, and if we start to see the pudding going sour, then we'll go and eat another one. That's a terrible analogy, but you know what I mean. Good. So we've heard a fairly wide-ranging discussion on the topic of why Sam Altman was fired and rehired, and it would be interesting to hear his view on whether he thinks any of that is even remotely true or close to the mark or whatever. But I think it does go to show that there's a lot of different things to consider, and that society needs to consider, and that businesses need to consider when they're thinking about AI, and particularly from a sort of ethics standpoint. I don't think this is a discussion that's going to stop, but our discussion is. So thank you for listening to the podcast or watching it. I've been Giles.
I've been Graham.
And I've been Rich.